Every Sunday morning for 22 years, a man in Memphis, Tennessee, pressed the same navy blue suit, knotted the same striped tie, and drove to Greater Hope Baptist Church on Lamar Avenue. And every Sunday morning for 22 years, a man in Knoxville, Tennessee, pressed the same navy blue suit, knotted a tie that was nearly identical, and drove to a small Presbyterian church on the west side of town. They had not spoken to each other since they were 12 years old. They did not know they shared this ritual. They did not know they would both end up standing on the Family Feud stage on the same afternoon in October 2019, or that one of them would say something so ugly it would stop the show cold, or that Steve Harvey would pull out his earpiece, step between them, and say 4 words, "Not on my show," that would be watched 412 million times. But before that moment, before the cameras and the silence and the thing that made Steve Harvey cry harder than he has ever cried on television, there were 2 boys on Maple Street. October 11th, 2019, a Friday afternoon taping in Atlanta. The Washington family, James, 53, his wife Denise, their son Terrence, 24, their daughter Aisha, 21, and James's brother Marcus, stood at the left podium in matching burgundy shirts. The Dawson family, Craig, 53, his wife Linda, his brother Tom, his sister-in-law Beth, and his nephew Kyle, 19, stood at the right podium in white polos. During introductions, Steve asked James what he did for a living. James said he was a high school football coach in Memphis. Steve asked Craig the same question. Craig said he managed a hardware store in Knoxville. Neither man looked at the other. Neither man mentioned Maple Street. Neither man mentioned that they had once been best friends, or that they had once shared a bicycle, or that they had once carved their initials into the same oak tree in a backyard that no longer existed. But the real story hadn't even started yet. Maple Street, in the Binghamton neighborhood of Memphis, was 7 blocks long, lined with shotgun houses, and in 1978, it was one of the few streets in the city where black and white families lived side by side. James Washington and Craig Dawson were born 3 months apart in houses that shared a fence. They met at age 4. They were inseparable by 5. They walked to Springdale Elementary together every morning, shared lunches because Craig's mother packed extra sandwiches and James's mother packed extra cookies, played catch in the alley between their houses until the streetlights came on, and slept at each other's homes so often that both mothers kept a spare toothbrush in the bathroom. James was quiet and steady. Craig was loud and fearless. They balanced each other the way only childhood best friends can, without effort, without negotiation, without any awareness that the world would eventually tell them they weren't supposed to be this close. In 1986, when both boys were 12, Craig's father, Earl Dawson, announced the family was moving to Knoxville. He told Craig it was for a job. That was a lie. Earl was leaving because the neighborhood was changing. His word, spoken in a tone that carried a meaning Craig was too young to decode, but old enough to absorb. The night before the move, Craig climbed the fence and sat on James's back porch. Neither boy cried. Neither boy knew what to say. James gave Craig his baseball card collection, 342 cards in a shoebox. Craig gave James a pocket knife his grandfather had given him. They shook hands like men because they'd seen their fathers do it, and then Craig went home, and the next morning the Dawson family was gone. What happened to Craig Dawson over the next 40 years is a story about how hatred is planted in children who don't have the tools to pull it out. Earl Dawson was a quiet, functioning racist, the kind who never used slurs at the dinner table but who locked the car doors in certain neighborhoods, who changed the channel when certain people appeared on television, who made small comments that landed in his son's brain like seeds in wet soil. Craig absorbed it. Not all at once, not dramatically. It happened the way most racism happens, slowly, through 1,000 tiny permissions, 1,000 unchallenged assumptions, 1,000 jokes that nobody corrected. By the time Craig was 25, he had opinions he couldn't trace back to evidence. By the time he was 35, those opinions felt like facts. By the time he was 45, they felt like identity. He never thought about James Washington. He never thought about Maple Street. He never thought about the boy who shared his bicycle and carved initials next to his in an oak tree. That boy existed in a locked room in Craig's memory, and the door had been sealed shut by 4 decades of his father's quiet poison. And then said something no one was prepared for. Craig's daughter Emily married a black man named David in 2016. Craig did not attend the wedding. He told Linda he had the flu. Another lie in a family that was filling with them. Emily stopped calling. She had a daughter, Craig's only grandchild, a little girl named Maya, now 3 years old, whom Craig had never met. Linda begged him to reconcile. Craig refused. The silence between Craig and Emily calcified into something that felt permanent. Linda applied to Family Feud without telling Craig the full reason. She thought maybe winning something together, laughing together, being on television together would crack something open in him. She thought the game would fix what conversation couldn't. She didn't know James Washington would be on the other side of the stage. Nobody did. The game went 3 rounds. The Washingtons won the first. The Dawsons won the second. Tensions were normal, competitive, nothing unusual. In the 3rd round, the question was, name something a good neighbor does. Terrence Washington buzzed in and said, brings food when someone's sick. The board revealed it was the number 2 answer. Craig buzzed in next and said, minds their own business. The answer wasn't on the board. Steve made a joke, something light about nosy neighbors. The audience laughed. Craig didn't. His face hardened. As the round continued, Craig lost the steal. The Washingtons celebrated. And as James Washington's family hugged at their podium, Craig Dawson muttered something under his breath. Not into the microphone, but loud enough for the front 3 rows to hear. A racial slur, directed at the Washington family. A woman in the 2nd row gasped. The sound carried. Steve heard it. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey stopped walking. He was halfway between the podiums, heading back to center stage, and he just stopped. His body went rigid. He turned slowly toward Craig Dawson. The producers in the control room saw Steve's face on the monitor, and one of them said into his earpiece, "Steve, keep it moving. We'll handle it in post." Steve reached up, removed his earpiece, and placed it on the podium. The 3rd time in his career he had done that. "Stop everything," Steve said. His voice was low, controlled, and absolute. "Did you just say what I think you said?" Craig's face went pale. The audience was frozen. Linda Dawson's hand was over her mouth. Kyle, Craig's 19-year-old nephew, stepped back from his uncle like he'd been burned. Steve walked directly to Craig's podium, not around it, not at an angle, directly to it, and stood 3 feet from Craig Dawson's face. "Not on my show," Steve said. 4 words, not shouted, not performed, spoken with the kind of authority that comes from a man who has earned the right to draw a line. Craig looked at the floor. "Look at me," Steve said. Craig didn't. "I said look at me." Craig raised his eyes. They were wet. Steve studied him for a long time, 5 seconds, maybe 6. which on live television feels like 5 minutes. Then Steve said something no one expected. "I know you." Not literally, not yet. Steve didn't know about Maple Street or the baseball cards or the oak tree. What Steve meant was deeper. "I know what's in you because I've seen it before. That word didn't start with you. Somebody taught you that. Somebody planted it. And you've been watering it your whole life without knowing it." Steve's voice cracked for the first time. "But I need you to hear me. You just said that word to a man standing 10 feet away from you. Do you even know his name?" Craig was shaking. "James," he whispered. And then something happened that no script could have written. James Washington stepped out from behind his podium and walked across the stage. 200 people watched a black man walk toward the man who had just called his family a slur. Denise grabbed James's arm. He gently removed her hand. He walked until he was standing next to Steve, facing Craig. And James said, "Craig, it's me." The studio fell completely silent. Craig's face collapsed. Not anger, not shame. Recognition. 41 years of sealed memory broke open in a single second. His childhood best friend was standing in front of him, wearing a burgundy shirt, looking at him the way he had looked at him on that back porch in 1986. Craig's legs gave out. He grabbed the podium to stay upright. "James," he said again. But this time it wasn't an answer to Steve's question. It was a name he hadn't spoken in 4 decades. But Steve wasn't done. Steve looked at both men, and the weight of the moment hit him visibly. His shoulders dropped, his eyes filled, and he pressed his fist against his mouth, the way he does when he's trying to hold himself together on camera. "Let me tell you something," Steve said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I almost didn't make it. There was a night, a long time ago, when I wrote a goodbye letter to my family. I was done. I was ready to mail it and disappear." The studio was so quiet the air conditioning was audible. And a stranger at a gas station, a man I never saw again, told me God had a plan bigger than my pain. I held on to those words because they were all I had. Steve looked at Craig. "Someone planted something dark in you a long time ago. But someone also planted something good, because I watched you mouth that man's name just now, and your voice broke when you said it. The good is still in there. It's just been buried." But Steve wasn't done. He asked a producer for a phone. The producer hesitated. Steve extended his hand and waited. The phone was placed in his palm. Steve looked at Craig. "Your wife told our producers backstage that you have a daughter you haven't spoken to in 3 years, and a granddaughter you've never held." Craig's face crumbled. Steve dialed the number Linda had given the production team during intake. The phone rang twice. A woman's voice answered. "Emily," Steve said. "My name is Steve Harvey. Your father is standing in front of me right now, and I think he has something he needs to say to you." Steve handed the phone to Craig. 200 people watched a 53-year-old man hold a phone to his ear with a trembling hand and say, through sobs, I'm sorry, baby. I want to meet her. I want to meet Maya. I'm so sorry." Emily was crying on the other end. The audience could hear her through the phone's speaker. Steve turned away from the podium and faced the crew. Camera operators had stopped operating. They were just standing behind their rigs, with tears running down their faces. A lighting technician sat down on the floor. The stage manager was holding a clipboard against her chest with both hands, shaking. Steve stepped to camera 2 and addressed the audience. "Everyone watching at home, hate is not born. It is taught. It is planted in children by people they trust, and it grows in the dark because nobody shines a light on it. This man said an ugly word today, but what's uglier is the father who put it in his mouth 40 years ago. And what's beautiful is that it only took 10 seconds of looking at his old friend to remember who he was before the poison. He looked directly into the lens. If you're carrying someone else's hate, put it down. It was never yours. Steve turned back to the families. He awarded both the full $20,000. He paid the Washingtons' share from his own pocket. He announced the creation of the Maple Street Project, seeded with $200,000 from the Steve Harvey Foundation, dedicated to funding anti-racism education programs in schools and community reconciliation initiatives in neighborhoods undergoing demographic change. James's daughter Aisha, 21 and studying education at the University of Memphis, was named the Foundation's first youth ambassador. Then, James Washington did something that nobody asked him to do and nobody could have predicted. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a pocket knife. Old, worn, wooden handle, blade dulled from decades. Craig's grandfather's knife. The one Craig had given him on that back porch in 1986. James had carried it for 41 years. Craig saw it, and his knees hit the floor for the second time. James knelt beside him, put the knife in his hand, and said, "I never stopped being your friend. You just forgot how to be mine." The studio fell completely silent. Aisha's 9-year-old cousin, a little girl named Nia, who had been watching from the front row of the audience, tugged Steve's jacket as he walked past. Steve knelt down. She looked at him with wide brown eyes and asked, "Are you sad, Mr. Steve?" Steve's composure finally broke. He pulled the girl into a hug and said 5 words into the top of her head that a boom mic caught and the internet would never forget. Hate is taught, not born. The clip was uploaded that night. Within 48 hours, it had 67 million views. Within 1 month, 412 million views across every platform. The hashtag Maple Street trended worldwide for 14 days and in 61 countries. Schools in 23 states incorporated the clip into their curricula. Churches screened it during services. The Maple Street Project received $18.9 million in its first year and funded anti-racism programming in 740 schools across 34 states. Craig Dawson met his granddaughter Maya for the first time on Thanksgiving 2019, 6 weeks after the taping. Emily later told a reporter that Craig sat on the floor of her living room and let Maya climb into his lap, and that he held her for 45 minutes without saying a word. Craig entered a racial reconciliation counseling program in Knoxville. He completed it in April 2020. He and James began talking on the phone every Sunday, the same day they had both spent 22 years pressing blue suits and driving to church alone. In a 2022 interview with CBS Sunday Morning, Steve was asked how he knew to push Craig instead of having him removed from the stage. Steve thought for a moment. "Because removal is easy," he said. "Removal doesn't fix anything. That man was going to leave that studio and go home and still be carrying the same poison. I didn't want to remove him. I wanted to reach him." The interviewer asked if it worked. Steve nodded slowly. "He called me last Christmas. He said he and James were having dinner together. Their grandkids were playing in the yard. He said, 'Steve, I got my friend back.' And I said, 'No, brother, you got yourself back.'" In March 2024, James Washington and Craig Dawson stood together at a podium in Memphis and announced the Maple Street Community Center, built on the lot where their childhood houses once stood. The center offers after-school tutoring, free counseling, and a program James designed called Fence Talks, named after the fence they shared as kids, where neighbors from different backgrounds sit and talk for 1 hour a week. The oak tree is gone, but carved into the wooden sign above the center's front door are two sets of initials, J.W. and C.D. A man pressed a blue suit every Sunday for 22 years and drove to church alone. 400 miles away, another man did the same thing. They had been best friends once, before someone taught one of them to hate. It took a game show, a slur, and a man named Steve Harvey refusing to look away to bring them back to the fence they once shared. Some things that are broken by hate can only be repaired by someone brave enough to stand in the middle and say no. If this story reminded you that the people we've lost aren't always gone, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell right now. We tell these stories every week because somebody out there needs to hear them. The next one might be the story that makes you pick up the phone and call someone you haven't talked to in years. Subscribe now. Don't wait.